We've all been born into a narrative which surrounds us, and it's often difficult to see that we're inside of a narrative. That's why this historical context is so useful. But if we're just inside of the game, you and I and Jeff Bezos were all born into the same narrative. Jeff's really good at playing the game. He's really good at working for advantage inside the existing narrative. There's nothing about that narrative that he can't make use of. So welcome to Questions Men Ask, a podcast for men who are breaking out of the mold of conventional masculinity, who are learning to question what is because they're interested in what could be. That's you, that's me, that's my co-host, Jared. Hi, Jared.
Hey, everyone.
Jared and I'm Jon, will be taking you through a conversation today about the story of men. How did we end up in the culture where we are now? What are the forces that shaped the world in which we were born? And I'm going to tell a story about how I think that happened and follow on with a discussion between Jared and I. It's a wonderful conversation. I'm glad you're here.
Well, Jon, I heard you took a walk the other day and you found a sweet little spot to share a story with us. And I'm eager to hear what you had to say to us.
Let's go look at it.
Yeah.
Hi, today I want to tell us a story, the story of men. I want to see if we can understand how it is we arrived at a place where we're in the culture that we are, where the mold that you and I were poured into has us act in particular ways which don't always seem to be in our own best interest or in the best interests of everybody. Where did the story of men begin, and how did it then create the world that we live in now? There is no better place to start the story than on the land and in the presence of a beautiful mountain. This Mount Tamalpais in the distance there, widely revered as sacred, a beautiful center point in Marin County, California. Here we are on the land, because that's where the story began. Let's see how it develops. Maybe you and I sat around a fire years ago, and maybe we're celebrating fertility. We're celebrating that the earth gave us food today. We're celebrating that it gave us clean water to drink. We're celebrating that a woman in our tribe is pregnant, and that means more life, that means the continuation of our line. We're sat celebrating fertility and in reverence for the world that we live in, connected into it in a way which is difficult for us to understand. We've come to think of the natural world as other, separate from us, a place we go on weekends or for vacations. But back then we would have had a very different relationship to it, and the best illustration I ever got of that was deep in the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador, in an Achua village that's threatened by oil companies coming in to explore for oil. And the local people are indignant about this and determined to oppose it in every way possible. And I remember a group saying to us, we will do what it takes. We will give our lives to protect the forest. And then one man stepped forward, small man, but with a mighty presence. And he looked me in the eye and he said, you have to know, not only am I living in this forest, I want you to know I am this forest. It's taken me a long time to even begin to accept the depth of connection that represents, because it's so absent in our modern lives. But perhaps our origins are back there. Let's see how the story develops. I'd like to fast forward a little bit to the moment where, by our own ingenuity, we discovered that we could actually collect seeds that were falling from a tree or a plant and transport them to a different place and put them in the ground and grow them there. I'd like you to imagine that we had the idea that we could somehow control the movement of the grazing animals that we fed off, and somehow perhaps put them behind fences or herd them in a way that allowed us to have access to them for food, for skins, for milk, whatever it might be, as and when we needed. This is the birth of our agricultural revolution. And in that transition, where we ceased to have to roam, to hunt and gather, we began to settle in one place, and we began to herd and grow crops. Some really important ideas were born in those moments that I suggest didn't exist previously. First is the beginnings of the idea that we have control over the natural world. Up until then, we would have been going in search of the fruits of the land for our sustenance. Now we have developed the capacity to have those fruits grown where we need them, or herded where we need them. And so the idea that we can somehow control the natural world was, I suggest, born then. It continues today in the ways that we see, where the entire world is seen as a set of natural resources that we can chop down or extract or convert in whatever ways we want to suit our own lives. We didn't begin with that idea. That was born, I suggest, the early days of the agricultural revolution, along with a couple of other key ideas. One of the other ideas that was born then was the idea of property. And I'd like you to imagine that you've had a successful summer, the weather's been good, your crop has been a bumper crop, you're able to set aside enough grain not only to see you through the winter, but more than that, maybe 2 winters worth, and you've got a surplus. All of a sudden you've got a choice. What do I do with this surplus that can be to my benefit? And the idea of owning something for our own benefit rather than it being for the good of the community is perhaps born there. Owning something for my benefit becomes property. And we live in a world our entire legal system is based around the protection of the right of property. So that idea arises. A third and maybe even more insidious idea perhaps arises there. It's hard to argue with the need for large families when you're living in that very tough existence on a settlement, growing and herding. It's hard to argue that a big family is anything but a blessing. And so you can imagine wanting a bigger family to help you grow the crops, herd the animals and so on. And you can imagine beginning to want to control the life of a woman such that she is there able to bear children for you when you need her, that she is somehow committed to or controlled by you in a way that has her offspring be count honourable. Is this the origin of the idea that women are the property of men? Let's look at another revolution that happened. We'll go to the Industrial Revolution now and see how that helped in the formation of the culture that we live in and the way we're raised as men. The Industrial Revolution is really interesting. It's the period when we discovered that we could make use of fossil fuels to mechanize work. That's it in a nutshell. So trees like this, which would have absorbed sunlight for millions of years, and then as they died, they would have composted on the forest floor, and then over time they would have been piled underground, compressed over eons, such that we had the alchemical process that creates oil and gas. We learned to tap into oil and gas and use them to mechanize work. We would make a machine that could do the labor of many men. We would make a machine that could plow a field that would have taken us days. We can plow a field now behind a tractor in a fraction of the time. So the mechanization of work, and alongside that, we have to understand that ordinary people will be being denied access to the land. So in the UK, where I'm from, a series of laws that enclosed the common grazing ground meant that I no longer had the option to farm and sustain myself, but I was in effect being encouraged towards the factories. I'm not saying this is a coordinated thing, but the way to sustain myself becomes to go to the factory and sell my labor there to earn the money that it takes to buy the food that I used to grow. And that, what a crazy notion, but that's in effect what's happened. And so in the Industrial Revolution, if we try to coalesce it to its essence, we find the drive towards mechanized work, we find the arising of gendered work, often men in factories, still women for the large part, confined to the roles of child raising. And we see that this new world in which capital can grow itself by investing, or capital can be grown, we see the emergence of a capitalist economy in which we can see that we as men have control for the largest part of that whole project. It's designed by men for the benefit of men. And we see the basis of some of our patriarchal thinking in that. It's also a place where we can see, it's not the only place in history where we could see this, but it's a place where we can see the origins of competition between men. So I can be a factory hand, or I can be somebody with capital who's able to invest that. How do I get from here to there? And that sense that we still live with today, that us as men are in some way in some silent competition with each other. That's a function of today's world that you can see being certainly accelerated by the Industrial Revolution. So we've got those two different revolutions that are helping to lay down the shape of a culture that's patriarchal in nature, dominated by men, for the benefit of men, centered around the way men think and act and do. I want to come to today, but I also want to name something that happened, and it's more difficult to pin this down to a particular place in time. But I'd like you to imagine what it might have taken to wrench you from that fireside where we were sat, in reverence of all that provided us with our sustenance, in reverence for life, in reverence of the fertility of life. What did it take to cause you or I to leave that place and become part of a patriarchal culture, and become the beneficiaries of a culture that's organized for men at the expense of women? Because that's what happened. Not only were we co-opted to be beneficiaries of that system, but somehow we were co-opted to be the agents of that, agents of the growth of that system. And I'd like you to imagine a little scene for me. An army is being raised to go and invade the neighboring land. And this might be at any point in history, but imagine what it takes to cause you, a man who primarily orients around reverence for life, to join an army to go and dispossess another people of their land, to terrorize, rape and kill them in the name of expanding the benefit of the place that you called home. The force and the energy that was required to co-opt you into that, co-opt me into that, I've seen it in dreams, I've seen it in medicine work, an enormous force of energy. That force of co-option exists today. We are still being persuaded as men by the culture, by politicians you can see if you turn on the TV, who will tell you that women should be at home, men should be at work, who will try and reinforce the traditional roles that we were poured into as boys, who will try and reinforce a culture which is directed by men primarily for the benefit of men. The force of co-option exists even today. And I mention it because I know how important it is, and I encourage you to be aware, alert to it. Let's skip to today. Today, you might say we are in the information revolution. Some people argue that started with the production of the printing press, but it's been so accelerated of late by the internet and by the advance of technology, so that now, with a couple of thumb clicks, I can be listening to the opinions of somebody from the other side of the world. I can be sharing my opinions just as I am now with the rest of the world. There is now no bar of entry for the dissemination of ideas. Ideas that used to be controlled by churches or states or education systems can no longer be controlled in the same way. We're in a flux of information. We're actually in the age of questioning, because what has been revealed by this glut of information we have access to is we can start to see and feel the cost in our own lives and the cost to us socially of the existing way of doing things. It's visible to us. We start to be questioning of how it is I'm supposed to act as a man. Is it because my dad told me? Is it because that's the way I was educated? Is it that's the way the culture wants me to see it and the way that Hollywood glorifies? Or am I now able to find access to other ideas? There's a force alive in our culture which is in the force of individualization, which really says you can be however you want. You don't need to conform. It invites us to choose who we be, how we look, and to hone our own identity to be unique to us. So it's no wonder that people are now asking questions about everything that was laid down as how it should be. We're asking questions of all of those norms. We're asking questions of the dominant narrative. We're asking questions about the mold that I was poured into, the way I was encouraged to behave as a boy and as a man. We're asking questions. I celebrate that we're asking questions, that this is the age of questioning. I celebrate the questions that men ask. I celebrate that you're here with me trying to find your own answers to some of these questions that are driven by the desire to live in a world that's more equitable, more fair, more sustainable, with less suffering. A world that's back in balance is what we're wired to create. It's that same DNA as had us sat around together around the campfire. That same DNA is present, calling you to ask questions. Thank you for all of your questions. Thank you for being a questioning man. And my great wish is that you find answers that help you live a more fulfilling, more enjoyable life as a contribution to the greater whole. That's my wish for you, and that's my wish for me.
You know, Jared, I had so much fun recording that, and I'm conscious that I could have been up there for an hour.
Yeah.
And what I was trying to do was put together some complex ideas in a very short period of time. So I'm curious what jumped out at you from what I said.
Mm. I'm really present to some grief of the impacts that march of progress has had on, like, where that shows up in my life. When you're sharing about us sitting around the fire with deep reverence for life, I'm present to my longing for that, and my gratitude that there are fires I get to sit around and have a modern experience of that. But I also deeply grieve that that's not a nightly occurrence.
Right.
That's not always present.
I sometimes reflect on the way that we have a remembering of these ancient ways.
Yeah.
And some people would say it's in our DNA. Some people would say we remember. I don't know that I know what the process is, but there's a part of you're telling me that connects to a very old idea, a very old feeling of togetherness in reverence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that that still is alive in you and can be touched is an important clue in all of this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree.
What else did you see? And what else would you have liked elaboration about? Was there
Ugh.
anything that got skipped over or didn't get enough attention?
I mean, yeah, like you said, you could have been up there for probably a lot more than an hour. It's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating march of progress. So there's a lot. I really, when I think about that shift from deep belonging to the land and to our people, and not having those boundaries between this is me and this is you, or this is me and this is the natural world. I am the natural world. I'm also present to the trade-offs of that shift to going from being a migratory people to, oh no, this is where we live now and we tend this land only, and this is my crop and my yield. You stay away. I'm going to protect this from you. And yeah, decision making power moving further and further away from me and my people, and being put on me, and without accountability. There's no one I can go complain to that can do anything about it anymore. And the way, I'm a very spiritual person, and I know that shift also was this huge shift of living in an animate world where spirit is all around us. It's in everything. There's gods and goddesses all around me, to spirit lives in the sky in some realm where I can't access. And as time moves further and further away, and institutions grow up that are gatekeeping and
Yeah.
are your only access to spirit, and
I need a
they
man
tell
in a
you the way
frock
it
to
is.
help me speak to God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's not a personal relationship anymore. And that I have so much grief about that.
Interesting, the theme of grief there, grief for what was. If I listen to that, it's as if the story tells a story of the continuing loss of something.
Mhm. Yeah.
And in some ways, I think that's important because one of the ideas I was trying to convey was about the intrinsic nature of our capacity to coexist with each other in the natural world, and how that's been distorted over time by, yes, agricultural revolutions, yes, industrial revolutions, and other forces. I was massively reducing the amount of information I could put across in just 15 minutes. But we have been on that journey of moving away from something that we're wired for. And so we can see the culture of today as a distortion, a corruption of the forces that we feel within us. and which you're noticing are not present now, and which you're grieving. Yeah, thank you for that reflection. I
Yeah.
also said you mentioned there about how power's been moved away from our where we live and act, and now we are in so many ways being controlled or living within the decisions of people who are many very far away from where I live and what I'm interested in, who are governing for millions of people, not for handfuls of families. And that shift, inevitable as population has grown, has also created a way in which we've governed for the good of men at the expense of women, and that's a whole part of the shift as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in this conversation, as we're exploring, like, how did this mold get created that we find ourselves in as men, I'm also present to that who gets to say what that mold is and what it looks like moves further away from us. Instead of growing up in this tight knit community of people and modeling my behavior on the way the men in my life be and act in deep relationship with the world, and me even then in it, because it's a small group, so I get my own say in that and I get my own expression in that, versus I have to go work in a factory and that's the job that's available to me, and I have to show up inside of a box that's appropriate in that environment, and my partner, my wife, has to show up inside of a box that's appropriate for her life, and she gets way less say in that than I even do. At least I might be able to vote, or have some sense of power or own property. And that was the other really big piece in this was private property, and that being applied to women in a lot of ways. And again, grief of that, the dynamics that led to that seeming to be appropriate in the culture of the day.
If I was recording that again, I would have tried to make it even more personal, the way that we have allowed this shift to happen so that men treat women in a particular way. And when we say men treat women, we're abstracting a great deal. What we're talking about is what happens to our daughters, our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, and how we have allowed the creation of a society, how we've been co opted. It was what I was saying. We've been co opted into a culture which marginalizes and subjugates mothers, wives, daughters at the expense of my good, what's good for me. And when we personalize it in that way, how did we do this? How was it we came to see that that was okay?
Yeah. Yeah, and I know, you share from time to time about your belief in the intrinsic nature of humanity, that we are loving, good people. And so that's another theme, as we look at, like, how did the mold get to be this way? And it's really easy to be like, oh, well, it's the evil monarchs, it's the evil people who created this system. And I know that's not how you or I really think about it. I'm curious if you would give some voice to, like, your relationship to, yeah, who were there bad guys in this story?
Right, right. We've all been born into a narrative which consumes, surrounds us, and it's often difficult to see that we're inside of a narrative. That's why this historical context is so useful. But if we're just inside of the game, you and I and Jeff Bezos were all born into the same narrative. Jeff's really good at playing the game. He's really good at working for advantage inside the existing narrative. There's nothing about that narrative that he can't make use of. He's tapping into the elements in all of us that want things. He's providing what we want at same day delivery if we even click the right buttons. So he's playing inside the narrative, and he's been able to do that and amass this amount of wealth that is really difficult even to comprehend. You and I are playing in the same narrative. Is Jeff a bad guy? Is he a good guy? He's following his human instincts inside the culture that he's been born into. And so I don't think we're in a world of good guys and bad guys. We're in a world of to what degree are we conscious of the effect of the narrative we're living in and the effect of our own behaviors when we live and act from that place. And when we get to a place where we consciously know we're doing harm to others, well, maybe there's a line there. But at the point of action, we're all swimming in contaminated water.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of metaphors mixed here, but the idea is that the narrative actually doesn't work for anybody. Some people are
Right.
using it to their advantage. Some people are trying to step out of it.
Yeah.
Different reactions to the same context.
Yeah. And I'm present to the grief and whether people can process that grief or not. And if they can't, the way that turns into wounding and how that just reinforces the narrative and can twist it and wrap it in even more impactful ways. And it just has this, I've heard it called a sickness of humanity, of losing that empathy and relationship and care for one another because it's not available. There's so much wounding that we have to try to work through to even be able to do that. And as you share about the impacts where it lands in our lives of this women as property thread through history, and I think about the impact that has on men. Like I look at my grandparents and the roles they played, or even further back ancestors, and like what were the impacts on the men who were living the narrative that women are basically property. They don't have rights. They don't have a say. I'm the head of the household. I'm the leader. I get to say, like, that's a really hard place to be. Not comparing the two, but I'm saying that in order to uphold that narrative, there's got to be some real damage you're doing to yourself. There's a lot of suppression of that inherent empathy and love and care to be able to do that, and probably a lot of fear of breaking outside of that mold.
Yeah, to pick up on that, the idea that we've lost something that for the apparent gains of being the beneficiaries of the patriarchal culture, we have cut ourselves off from a really important fundamental part of ourselves, which we've denied or suppressed in different ways, so that we can exist inside this very corrupted culture. Yeah, so men are seemingly the beneficiaries of the patriarchy, and at the same time have a tremendous loss themselves. Don't want to compare that with the loss that women have. They're not comparable.
Right.
Everybody loses.
Yep.
If you condense that whole story that I told, it's our descent into a culture that actually serves none of us, is imperiling our very future, and needs that we exit from it as quickly as possible. And so, from as our cultures entered into this place and forces have tried to contain us within there, this age of questioning, this need to question, to look at and say, why are we working with these molds? Why are we stuck in this narrative? That becomes essential. So, yay, questions men ask, because that's the force that's going to break us free from something that's costing everybody their current enjoyment and their future.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful for your story and for this conversation and how it really provides context for how we got here. How did we get ourselves into this mess? Um, and looking at it from this societal level, and to you, the listener, I hope this helps you feel more informed and more present to this cultural mold that we find ourselves in. And I'm excited to explore in our next episode where that lands in us, where that lands on an individual level in our families, and in the own formation of our own identity as a man, and where we push against the cultural mold, the family mold, and where that chafes, and what to do about it. So, yeah, I'm really grateful for orientation, that and the way that context really provides that for us, and looking at this thread through history, to help us really identify what's going on here. How did we get to be here? What were the forces that shaped this mold, so that we can see it more and identify it more. So yeah, thank you for your beautiful story and for leading this conversation. And yeah, I'm taking a lot away from it.
Grand. Well, thank you. It's important to lay out this context, and I hope we can use that as orientation, because next week what we're going to do is we're going to look, as you were hinting there, we're going to look at, well, how was the force of life that's Jared? How was that shaped from your birth onwards? How have you become the man that you are? How have each of our listeners become the men who they are today? That's where we're going in the next episode. Yeah.
Awesome. Excited for it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening today. I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast wherever you found it. I want to remind you that we have a free drop-in. You'll find in the show notes a way to join the drop-in conversation with men from all over the world who've been attracted to this podcast because they've got questions to ask. And it's a Zoom call where you get to come and bring your questions and your answers, and we'll share wisdom around the theme of the particular meeting. You'll find the way to connect with that in the show notes. Please bring other men into this podcast. Spread the word, share the links, whatever you can do to have this conversation spread around in the world so that men get to ask more questions and find more answers. Thanks for listening.